Hello, welcome back to week 7 of the Jerusalem Science Contest. This week's exam will be on chapters 17 and 18. Chapter 17 is entitled The Science of Aquaculture, and it will deal with things like farming fish. And chapter 18 has to do with agriculture and the environment. So we're going to look, I've chosen this week to talk to you about pesticides in the environment, and I probably should have actually entitled this "Agriculture and the Environment" because we're not just going to be discussing pesticides, but we'll be discussing other phenomena that are related to agricultural science. So, first thing I want to talk about is something known as ecological risk assessment. Anytime anyone develops a new pesticide, there's two layers of responsibility. One is for the manufacturer. So the manufacturer has to do at least two things to satisfy the federal government. And one of them is to evaluate ecological effects and toxicity of the pesticide, if it's a new compound. And the other one is we're not just interested in things like acute toxicity, but we're also interested in chronic toxicity, and we'd be interested in the chemical fate and transport of that particular pesticide. In other words, how is this thing, once this thing is applied to the plant, what actually happens to it? How is it broken down? How is it metabolized? How is it broken down by, for instance, ultraviolet light? And how is it transported? How does it work its way through the food cycle, for instance? Then the EPA has to do certain things before they're going to actually allow a new pesticide to be used, and there are certain documents that have to be generated, and these include things like environmental exposure characterization and ecological effects. So this is similar to what we already talked about that the manufacturer was going to have to do. But again, the EPA is going to be looking at this a little bit more closely. And the final thing is something known as risk characterization. So one of the things that one has to look at are what are the undesirable effects that could occur from the use of an insecticide or a fungicide or a herbicide, and these can go anywhere from injury. It could be injury to animals in the environment. It could be injury to human beings. It could be death, but it could also be a decrease in the massive productivity of things like aquatic animals and terrestrial animals. So we're talking about birds, wild mammals. It could also affect plants and other non-target organisms, those things that we're not actually trying to control, we're not trying to kill them, but because of the pesticide itself, it's actually affecting these kinds of things. And these would include things like beneficial insects, or things that might be threatened or endangered. So anything that winds up being on the threatened and endangered list would be something that we'd be very much concerned about. So how do we characterize ecological effects? Well, one of the things that the EPA will do is look at strengths and weaknesses of the data. Not all data is good data. Some data, depending on how it's collected and how much data there is, you can't just look at raw data and say, oh, this is showing that there's something really awful going on here. So it has to be analyzed, and there are a variety of statistical methods that are used to analyze data. The other thing that you want to consider are sources of stressors. Stressor would be those kinds of things that are putting stress on the environment, environmental distributions and potential versus actual exposure. So we can look both at if animals or humans are actually being exposed to the pesticide, how does that compare with, we can look at the potential, that is what might happen if there's exposure, but then we have to look at what actually does happen if there's real exposure. And then this is very, very similar to what is done when a new drug is made. For instance, you're testing a new drug, so you have what's called a dose response curve. So this is, and now we've got a stressor response curve. So we look at for instance, at the amount of pesticide and how organisms will respond to that. So that's the stressor response relationship as opposed to a dose response relationship, similar kind of thing. And the relationship between the measurement of the effects and how we measure things and what are the assessment endpoints. So an assessment endpoint might be a point where we start to see some kind of illness occurring, some kind of loss of vigor of a population, or an assessment endpoint might actually be death. So those things have to be chosen very carefully. The Endangered Species Act is something else that has to be taken into consideration whenever we're looking at any kind of pesticide application. So the Environmental Protection Agency is mandated under this Endangered Species Act. It's actually called the Endangered Species Protection Program, the ESPP, and this is mandated under something known as FIFRA. That's the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. It was actually enacted by Congress in 1947, but it didn't really get teeth put into it for about another 25 years, because initially the purpose of the act was to protect the consumer against fake pesticides, fraudulent pesticides. And in 1972, a law was passed called the Federal Environmental Pesticide Control Act, and it was actually kind of an extension of FIFRA. And what it did was it changed the emphasis, FIFRA's emphasis, from protecting the consumer against fraudulent pesticides, and then dealing with public health and environmental issues. So that's where it is right now. So the goal of this act is not to place undue burden on agriculture and other pesticide users. We want to protect the environment, but we don't want to make it impossible for people to be able to use pesticides. The ESPP helps protect and promote the recovery of listed species. So a listed species is something that is an endangered species, something that is actually put on a list of endangered species. How is this done? Well, before an organism can be listed, we have to consider things like threats from habitat destruction, pollution, over-harvesting. In other words, if this is an animal that is being hunted, or it might be a particular kind of fish that is being collected, or a plant that is being harvested. If it's over-harvested, it could lead to, it could actually endanger that particular species. And predation is another thing. All these things have to be evaluated. How can we reduce pesticide impact? So there's two areas where pesticides are being used, and the one that we most usually think of is in an agricultural sense, but you have to realize that there are I think there's something like maybe 350 million people living in this country, so there's probably well over 100 million households, and many of these households are people that live in homes where they have gardens, and they apply pesticides to their gardens. So we're really talking about a significant amount of pesticide application just from home users. So the things that are recommended are, whenever you're using a pesticide, to follow the label instructions and to inspect the containers for leaks and corrosions. Anytime there's a leak or there's corrosion in the container and potentially that material can leak out, it's going to wind up being leaking into an area where ultimately it might wind up going into a drain sewer, and that could actually contaminate water supply. We have to be careful in mixing and cleaning equipment in areas where the rinsed water might actually enter sewers or storm drains. So in that case, all the water needs to be collected and disposed of in an appropriate way. You don't want to overuse these products. Don't use them only when they're necessary. And it's recommended to apply certain kinds of insecticides at night in order to, or other kinds, not just insecticides, but other kinds of pesticides, to apply them at night to protect bees, because bees normally forage during the day. So there's less likelihood that bees are going to be out. And some of the things that we're going to see in a few minutes about how pesticides drift, for instance, that will become less of a problem if these things are applied at night. The other thing is to use bait stations that are designed to prevent the access of non-target wildlife. So we don't want animals that we're not trying to control to get in. So if we're going to be, for instance, trying to control some kind of a four-footed creature that is attacking our crops, could be rabbits or whatever, we want to make sure that we're not harming other kinds of wildlife. In the agricultural sense, of course, this is going to be the biggest contribution to the environment. And again, an agricultural user is going to have to follow the label instructions and make sure that when they apply these things, or when they mix these things and they're cleaning out their equipment, that we don't get any of this runoff into the storm drains and gutters. They have to be a little bit more careful than the homeowner, because they also have to consider characteristics of the application site, such as what kind of soil is this? And also looking at things like the groundwater depth, how far below the, if they're going to apply something to their crops, where is the water table, how far below the ground and again looking at the type of soil, because certain soils will absorb pesticides better than others, and some soils, like sandy soils for instance, the water, the groundwater, or rather the pesticide can easily move into the groundwater because the soil itself does not have a lot of organic matter or clay, the kinds of things that could actually trap the pesticide. So these are important things to consider as well. The user must be aware of which pesticides have the greatest propensity for groundwater leaching, and again, that will depend on the chemical structure of the pesticides. Another thing that's recommended, and we've talked about integrated pest management techniques, because when we use these other kinds of techniques, the integrated pest management techniques, that generally means that we're going to be using less pesticides. If there's any spills, they have to be contained and cleaned up rapidly. And another thing that agricultural users want to do is when they're spraying their fields, there should be a border around the field that consists of areas that are not going to be treated. So by using this untreated border, it actually acts as a buffer zone to prevent the pesticide from spreading beyond their property, for instance, onto a neighbor's property. And again, they want to follow label precautions to protect pollinators, because there is something called colony collapse syndrome, and nobody's entirely sure what's happening, but bees, which are necessary for pollinating not just household flowers and things like that, but agricultural crops as well, are definitely being affected, and it's not certain yet. It's believed that it might be some kind of fungal infection, or it could even be some kind of disease that the bees are getting. But there's also a suspicion that some of this might be due to pesticide use. So we have to be very, very careful about that as well. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has published these results, or these data. And according to them, one or more pesticides have been detected more than 90% of the time in water, in over 80% of fish that were sampled, and in 33% of major aquifers. And they also indicate that pesticides are one of the 15 leading causes of impairment of streams. The third thing is that pesticides are a potential cause of amphibian decline and deformity. There seem to be a lot of things like newts and and salamanders that seem to be getting more monstrous kinds of growths that are occurring on them, and they might have extra limbs, and there are other kinds of deformity that are occurring, and that's sometimes been attributed to the overuse of pesticides. And pesticides, according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, are one of the potential causes of pollinator decline and affect other beneficial insects as well. So these are some of the potential negatives. What happens to pesticides when they're actually put into the environment? So there are a number of processes that are involved, and one of these, the first one, adsorption, actually has, and this is going to be related to chemical and microbial degradation. So that will be the process once a pesticide is actually adsorbed, which means that it's been applied to the surface of the plant, or it's been applied to the soil. It actually, at that point, is being held onto the particles in the soil, and while it's in the soil, there are microbes in the soil that might be acting upon it, degrading it. There's also chemical phenomenon. If it's on the surface of a leaf, UV radiation can degrade the material. So that's that's actually shown down here, photodegradation, but that's also a form of it's photochemical degradation. But there are other forms of chemical degradation that can occur as well. Another one is absorption. Once it actually gets into the plant, or if it gets into an animal, it can be metabolically degraded as well. So in animals or in plants, there are methods for actually metabolizing that particular pesticide. Pesticide can leach through the soil, so it can move down into groundwater. It can be photodegraded, as I said before. When it is sprayed, the spray does not necessarily, you spray it into a certain area, but that spray can drift beyond the area where you want to spray it. Also, because pesticides are organic compounds, some of them, but not all of them, have a certain degree of volatility, which means that they can easily be, especially when they're heated, when the sun's rays beat down on them, they can be converted into a gaseous form, so that will cause them to move from the plant, and they'll actually get into the atmosphere, and that again can cause some drifting. Another thing is runoff when pesticides are applied, and especially when they're over-applied, and if there is a lot of rain, this material then can not only leach through the soil, but can actually run onto a neighbor's property, or worse, it might actually the runoff might go into a stream, and that could contaminate the stream as well. And another way that pesticides are removed is actually because the crops themselves are harvested. And if the pesticide is actually on the crop, then we move the pesticide from its site of application, and now it's in the marketplace, or it's in the consumer's hands, or in your home. What are the human health effects? So here are 5 different pieces of information that I've got on this subject. One is that acute exposure may result in headaches and nausea, nerve, skin, and eye irritation, fatigue, and occasionally death. Yes, there have actually been recorded deaths. We know that some pesticides are extremely poisonous, and there have been people that have been killed accidentally because they ingested too much of this pesticide. It wasn't applied properly. There's also been murders that have occurred where people have actually poisoned other individuals using some of these compounds. So death is fairly unusual. It's fairly rare. It occurs more among livestock when pesticides are not used properly. Chronic exposure may result in endocrine disorders, reproductive effects, and cancer. A lot of this is kind of iffy in terms of, and it depends on what the pesticide is, and there are very, very few, there's certainly none that I know of that are actually licensed for use that are known to be carcinogenic. According to a 2009 study by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, and this is a federal agency, it indicated a two-fold increase in brain cancer rates among children in homes where pesticides are used. But this is really, really hard it's not really, I wouldn't consider that necessarily to be a smoking gun. A two-fold increase sounds very, very significant, but we don't really know all the parameters of this particular study, and we don't know what pesticides were being used, and it's not really, from what I can gather, I don't know how well this was actually controlled. A 2007 study of the Public Health Institute of California Department of Health Services and the University of California, Berkeley School of Public Health found a six-fold increase in autism among children whose mothers were exposed to organochlorine pesticides. And there are many, many fewer of those around now because they really are starting to be phased out. And again, this is one of these things where it looks like there's a smoking gun, but you know, it's a little hard to say for sure that this is really something that you can absolutely say that halogenated or chlorinated hydrocarbon pesticides are the kinds of things that when they're used are causing an increase in autism. I mean, autism certainly does seem to be on the rise, but it's not entirely sure what the cause is. And finally, a 2011 paper in Environmental Health Perspectives suggests the connection between paraquat absorption among farm workers and increased rates of Parkinson's disease. Now, this relationship is a lot more supportable, and I actually am going to talk about this in the next few slides. So before I get to that, I want to talk about a couple other interesting things. In one of the African nations, I think it's Cameroon's, there is a tree that is investigators have found high levels of a drug that's called tramadol. Tramadol is a synthetic opiate. It's very much like morphine. It was actually designed to mimic morphine. And the question comes up as to whether or not they're actually finding this in the roots of a particular tree. And this African tree, when they take the root off, there's kind of a bark that covers the root, and they found as much as 0.4% of tramadol of this particular compound. By the way, I don't expect you to memorize or to know learn the structure of this compound, but I only have it up here to show you the structural similarity between this compound and morphine. So it actually acts as a kind of a synthetic morphine. You've got this oxygen here. If you actually formed a bridge, well, it's not really quite the same thing, but it's got the methylamino group here, and here we've got a phenyl group. Here we have an OH, and here we have an OCH3. But these are still relatively similar kinds of compounds. Anyway, so tramadol is synthetic, but they're finding this stuff in the root of this plant, and as much as 0.4% of it by dry weight. So the investigators were very interested in trying to figure out, is this something that this plant actually makes? Because there are natural products that just happen to be the same as things that we might make in the lab. And even though this was first synthesized in the lab, there have been a number of people that have suggested that this is a product that is actually being biosynthesized by this particular tree, which is now the name of the tree. It's called the pincushion tree. So that particular tree was thought to be making tramadol. And this, by the way, at least in the United States, is a controlled substance. This is is something that if you were selling it or if you were using it, you could be arrested. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, would be very, very interested in anyone that was working with or using this kind of compound. certainly not legal in the United States. Apparently available in Africa, and farmers were taking this and feeding it to their livestock. Whatever creature it is that they were using to pull their plows through the fields, probably something like a bull or a steer, but whatever the local version of that happened to be. And they were feeding that to these animals, and then the animals would go near these trees, and of course they would urinate and they would defecate near the trees, and it's believed that what was happening is that the tramadol in their waste was actually being transported through the ground, and it was being taken up by the tree. So there's not a definitive answer to the question that I pose here. Is it a natural product? That is, it's something that the tree itself is making, or is it an agricultural artifact? But all of the evidence seems to be so far that it is actually an agricultural artifact. So it's something, because it's being applied in a way that it's really not intended to be used, it's winding up getting into the soil, and it's winding up getting into this particular tree, which also begs the question, could this be getting into other kinds of plants, and plants where it might ultimately be consumed by human beings? Okay, here's another little slide that I put together, which is kind of interesting, because this deals with a couple actual pesticides. Two of them that I've shown here are 2,4-D, 2,4-dichlorophenoxyacetic acid, and 2,4,5-T, which is 2,4,5-trichloro. This is the 2 position, 3,4,5 trichloro. This is the phenyl or phenoxy group, and this part here is acetic acid, which would normally be a CH3 COOH. These two compounds, this is the COOH right here. Here it's just being shown CH2, and here it's showing as COOH. This is the COOH. But these are essentially the same molecules, except this one has an extra chlorine atom. Now, when you make, oh, and by the way, this material, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, a 50-50 mixture of this was being used in Vietnam as a spray, and it was being sprayed in areas where the enemy, the Viet Cong, would hide out in these very, very densely bushy areas. So it was being sprayed there, something called Agent Orange. And a lot of people came back from Vietnam, and they complained about all kinds of health effects. And it was believed, or it was suggested for a long period of time, that that was due to an impurity that always occurs whenever you try to make 2,4,5-T. And the standard way of making it is to use 2,4,5-trichlorophenol and react that with, and again, this is not the right structure. This is a carboxylic acid. It's chloroacetic acid, so there should be a double bond here and an oxygen. And that would put this group 1 over here. And this is, of course, this is the 2,4,5-T. These are identical structures. Just things are rotated around a little bit here. But one of the other products that occurs, because instead of this reacting with this, it can also react with itself. So a molecule of this can react with another molecule of this, and then you produce small amounts of this compound. And this compound is called 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzodioxin, shown a little bit more prominently up here. This compound, for a long period of time, was considered to be one of the most toxic materials on the face of the earth. And the EPA got very, very concerned with this material, and they basically promulgated a rule that said that you couldn't incinerate or treat, you couldn't burn oil or any kind of material, waste products that had any traceable level. There was no level. If you could detect 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzodioxin in an oil or in any kind of waste, you basically had to hold on to it forever. You couldn't dispose of it. And having worked in this area, I actually developed a process in which we were able to chemically destroy these materials. But this is what I and many of my colleagues always refer to as a political poison. Because all the while that the EPA and the public were getting very, very upset about this, we were a little bit more rational in how we viewed this. Turns out that this compound is extraordinarily toxic if you happen to be a guinea pig. 1 microgram of this is usually enough to kill a guinea pig. However, you could give 1,000 times that dose or 2,000 times that dose to a rat, and the rat wouldn't even feel it. And probably if you gave doses that high or higher to human beings, they probably not much would happen to them as well. As a matter of fact, there was an accident that occurred in I believe it was 1975 or 76. It was an explosion that occurred at a chemical manufacturing plant where they were actually manufacturing. I don't know whether they were making the 2,4,5-T itself, but they were certainly producing, at least producing the 2,4,5-trichlorophenol, the compound that I'm showing you over here. This compound was being produced, and there was an explosion that occurred, and a great amount of this material was actually released into the environment. And it was calculated that up to 2 kilograms, up to about 2,000 grams of this material was actually released into the environment. And people came dressed in spacesuits, and they started covering this plant over and taking all the debris and packing it up and everything. And then they removed, I don't remember, so many feet of topsoil, and there was still material that was detected below that, but they really couldn't do much else with it. And ultimately, over the years, what they did was they replanted trees in that area. They even planted fruit trees in that area, and it became sort of a park after a while. And people would come by, and they would pick the fruit, and they would eat the fruit off of the fruit trees. And that fruit still contained quantities of 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzodioxin. What happens to somebody who's exposed to this material? Well, despite all the negative press that it got, and people said it was very, very toxic, and it caused cancer, and it did all these other things, there were literally thousands and thousands of people that were exposed. And some of them got exposures that were higher than anything anybody's ever seen in the United States. And I'm going to show you a picture, I believe it's on the next slide, of a little girl, or a little boy, I don't remember which, that actually has a disease that's called chloracne, which is caused by exposure to this agent. And you can see this child has a very, what looks like a very disfiguring series of pimples or acne all over his or her face. And in fact, that looks really awful. But what happens is, as soon as, after that exposure, shortly thereafter, I don't have a picture of this child afterwards, but everybody that did have chloracne, everyone that was exposed, their skin cleared up later on. And they actually started, to look at people who had been exposed, and started to look at them over a period of time, and found that even after 25, well, let's see, what did I say, 1975, so we're now 40 years later, so they've done epidemiological studies, and so far they've reported 1 incident of liver cancer, and this is among a population of several thousand people. There have been no incidents that can actually be pinned on the 2,3,7,8 excuse me, tetrachlorodibenzodioxin other than the chloracne. So this is something that was way blown out of proportion. As a matter of fact, there was a similar release, much, much smaller quantities that occurred in the United States in a place called Times Beach, Missouri. And this is a place where other chlorinated hydrocarbons, things that are called polychlorinated excuse me, biphenyls, they would actually have a bond between here, and no oxygen here, and no oxygen here. these ponds would be removed. And compounds like that were also considered to be in the same category. And they found levels of this in the soil, also levels of 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzodioxin, both in the soil and in the in a stream or river that ran through Times Beach. And all of the homes, basically that entire city, that entire community, was closed down by the federal government. People had to move out of their houses. They put a fence around the whole area, and there was no reason really to do this. I don't know whether that area is still under quarantine, but no one's ever been able to show that this material, any of these materials, were that dangerous that the government had to react in such a drastic measure. And as a matter of fact, probably within the last 10 years, the EPA has actually retracted a lot of the statements that they made about 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzodioxin, and they no longer believe that it's the great danger that it was initially. So these are just a couple things that I want to bring into the discussion of pesticides in the environment. Sometimes these things get blown out of proportion. I'm not saying that these things are not toxic, that they're not dangerous. As a matter of fact, the polychlorinated biphenyls, the biphenyls being the ones that I told you had a bond that went from here to here, those compounds actually did kill a lot of people because in Japan, someone had actually poured, I don't know whether it was done deliberately or accidentally, they poured the concentrated oil. Now this material, the polychlorinated biphenyls, were actually, and they were for a very long period of time, they're no longer being used in the United States. The reason that they contaminated Times Beach was that Monsanto had a plant nearby there, and Monsanto was manufacturing these polychlorinated biphenyls for use as dielectrics in transformers, electrical transformers. So they acted as insulators in the transformers, and they have a fire retardant property, which was very, very good. So it turned out that some of this oil in Japan actually got poured into cooking oil, and people were cooking with this material, and they were poisoned by it, but they were taking enormous quantities of it. So, but again, if these things were used responsibly and very, very small quantities were in the environment, the question is, do we really have to start pulling our hair out because of that? Here again, the Seviso. And one final thing that I wanted to talk about, because I did mention previously that there seemed to be some kind of a correlation, and this correlation, I do believe, a correlation between the use of a pesticide. It's actually a herbicide, and we've seen this before called paraquat, and this is paraquat right here. And between that, the use of that, and having Parkinson's disease. So I want to just relate to you a short story about the history of this. Here's a drug that was actually originally, I think it was probably the first synthetic narcotic that had ever been made. And it's a chemical compound by the name of Demerol. It also goes under the name of pethidine, and the generic name is meperidine. Now I know I have some personal history with Demerol because many years ago, I think I was passing a kidney stone, and the doctor who diagnosed me, not the one who diagnosed the fact that I was passing a kidney stone, but realized that I was in excruciating pain, prescribed for me this medication, Demerol. And when I took the Demerol, I almost died. I'm highly allergic to this drug, and it turns out that I became extraordinarily nauseous. And after I emptied out from vomiting, I continued to vomit, even though nothing was coming up, about every 5 minutes for 12 hours, and I was hospitalized. And until the doctor in the hospital realized that this was actually a Demerol allergy and gave me the antidote to it, at that point I actually recovered. But prior to that, this. I still think this, even for people that are not sensitive to it, it's a suspect kind of material. I think it's a very, very dangerous kind of material. But it's been around for a long period of time, possibly since the 1920s or 30s. It's quite old. And anyway, some years later, maybe 50 years after this drug was originally invented, this was back in the days when people were very much into taking illegal pharmaceuticals. People were making them, people were using them, and when this drug was actually made, when this was made originally, people started to investigate other kinds of what we call analogs by changing the structure a little bit. So imagine that you take this phenyl group. Actually, no. You break the bond right here. You take this entire group, this piperidine, this phenylpiperidine group right here, and this is an ethyl group. And you take the ethyl group and move it over to here, and you take this group and move it over to the oxygen. So what you wind up getting then is another compound. This is the same thing, but what I've done is I've switched the groups and put them onto different sides of the molecule. So this is a molecule called desmethylprotein. And this compound, I believe, was originally made in the 1940s. And this was made in Germany. And it was actually synthesized, this compound was actually synthesized by a German chemist who worked for a company called IG Farben. And IG Farben has some other very notorious activities. During the Second World War, it was Hitler's company that he used to produce so-called Zyklon B, which was a crude calcium cyanide that was used to kill millions of our people in gas chambers by the Nazis. So the same company that developed that developed this chemical compound. Anyway, we're moving forward to about the mid-1970s, where this was Barry Kidston, and I think this was maybe in the early 1970s. He was about 23 years old, a graduate student, and he read the initial synthesis of this compound, and he thought, well, you know what, this compound might be something that I could actually make. It wasn't listed by the Drug Enforcement Agency. It wasn't on any of the lists at the time, and he thought, if I can make this compound, this desmethylprotein, until they actually find out what it is that I'm making and selling, I can legally manufacture this material and sell it on the street, and no harm done, and I can't be prosecuted for it. Well, it turned out that the government ultimately did find out what it was, and they found out maybe sooner than Kidston would have liked, because it turned out that there was a doctor in California who was getting an unusually large number of patients that were coming to him, and they were very young people, and they had what appeared to be full-blown Parkinson's disease. Now, it's very, very rare for somebody in their 20s or 30s or even 40s to get Parkinson's disease. But when it occurs in a lot of cases, and this doctor had seen maybe 5 or 6 cases of it, he became really worried. What is going on here? And he checked all these people's backgrounds, and they came from entirely different backgrounds. Not one of them knew any of the other people. And the only thing he could find in common was that they were all drug users. They all used these illicit drugs. And they were taking something that was called China White, which is a name that is sometimes given to a certain kind of heroin. But this material was being sold on the street as China White. And it was this desmethylprotein. And then ultimately another individual came into his office, and that person wasn't a drug user. It turned out, I believe it was Kidston, and he'd never used the drug, but since he was manufacturing it, he was also exposed to it, and he also developed the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Now, it turns out that when you heat this material up to a certain temperature, if you cook it too much when you're making it, it actually eliminates propionic acid, which is this part of the molecule. And I'll hydrogen from here, and it produces a double bond. And it makes this compound called MPTP, methylphenyl tetrahydropyridine. So that's MPTP. When this material is ingested, it will cross the blood-brain barrier, where there are oxidases, enzymes that will oxidize it up, aromatizing it, converting it into a pyridine ring, a pyridinium ring, which you see right here. And this produces a compound called MPP+. This compound, if you look at it, structure that is very, very close to paraquat. And as a matter of fact, it's actually identical to another pesticide, another herbicide that was also being used, called cyperquat. So cyperquat and this actually have exactly the same structure. The chloride ion here, this would be associated with chloride or bromide or whatever other ions happen to be present in the environment. When this material is made, it's made as a chloride, but it doesn't really matter. Cyperquat and MPP+ are the same compound. When this material gets into the brain, this has been demonstrated, what it does is it reaches an area of the brain where there are motor neurons. It's called the substantia nigra. And when this gets into the motor neurons of the substantia nigra, it kills them. And as these start to die off, by the way, the motor neurons in the substantia nigra die naturally as we age. And you lose approximately 10% or so of them for every decade of life. So by the time someone's, let's say, 50 years old, they've lost half of them already. By the time they're 80 years old, they've lost 80% of them. You can pretty much function with only 10% of the motor neurons in your substantia nigra. You can still pretty much function normally. But as you start to get older and older, and these things start to die off, you start to see the typical kinds of degeneration and that you see in Parkinson's disease. The shaking of the hands, the uncontrollable shaking, the stiffness in the gait, difficulty in moving, all those things are part of Parkinson's disease. So when I first read the reports about this in the 1980s, I saw an immediate connection. As soon as I saw that, I remembered paraquat, and I later found out about cyperquat. And I said, oh, so what is actually going on here? If you go back to that previous slide, I think it's a few slides ago, where I talked about, right here, 2011 paper. When I saw that paper, I thought, well, that's really interesting. It took them that many years, 30 years before that, I already could see the connection between paraquat absorption and increased rates of Parkinson's disease, because I was aware of this later work that was done, and the fact that MPP+ was shown to actually chemically induce Parkinson's disease, and it's an irreversible condition. Well, that's all I have to say about this, but I hope you found that interesting, and I just wanted you to see that there are things that are used agriculturally that can be dangerous, but not everything that's put down on the ground is necessarily something that we have to lose a lot of sleep over. So again, we'll have our usual test, 25 questions, and probably 6 of them will be from this lecture. And I wouldn't worry too much about the chemical structures. I'm more concerned. I think you should be able to recognize what paraquat looks like by this point in time, because we've talked about paraquat before, and you can certainly see the connection between something like MPP+, paraquat, and cyperquat. So that would be something that I could conceivably ask you about. But the other kinds of structures that were in here, I wouldn't really worry about them. Again, I wish you hatzlacha on the exam, and I will see you next week. And thank you for your attention.